Okay, and thank you, Natasha, for the awesome day one intro. I think the best one so far. That was super interesting stuff. And I'm so honored and glad to be able to introduce you to the first talk of today. We will soon be joined by Joel DeWall for the first presentation on the techniques and tribulations required to ship Indiana Jones and the Great Circle at 60 Hertz. It's going to be awesome. I don't want to take too much time. Let me just do a proper introduction for our speaker. Remember, as Natasha mentioned, all questions go to Discord, and then we will try to answer them as much as possible live in a Q&A at the end of the presentation. Joel DeWall is a senior rendering programmer at MachineGames. He worked on the Shadow system as well as general rendering performance optimization for Indiana Jones, The Great Circle. Before joining MachineGames, he worked at Unity, where he contributed to the entity graphics, among other things. And now, without further ado, to our first talk of the day.
Hi, my name is Joel Vahl, and I work as a senior render programmer at MachineGames. Welcome to this presentation about shipping Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. MachineGames is a AAA studio located in Uppsala, Sweden, just north of Stockholm. We also have a small satellite office a bit further up north in Sundsvall, which I work out of. The studio has previously mostly been known for the Wolfenstein games, starting with 2014's The New Order. Announced in 2021, Indiana Jones shipped late 2024 for PC and Xbox, during the spring for PS5, and as the title of this presentation states, the game is a 60Hz title on all platforms, with a bit of difference in internal rendering resolution. The engine, motor, which is the Swedish word for engine, is a fork of id Tech 7, and we do quite a lot of technology sharing with id around rendering. The gameplay side, on the other hand, is quite different, but that's not the scope for this presentation. Team size, combined with production timeline, meant that we really had to focus our effort where it mattered. What in the engine could be kept the way it was? What did we need to replace or improve to ship the game we wanted to? A thing I want to stress is that what I will go over in this presentation was a highly collaborative effort by a big team, both internal and external to the studio. I will try to answer questions in the Q&A, but can probably only give general responses on areas I personally did not work on. Big thanks to the rendering team for the help collecting all the info to be presented here. In this presentation, we will go over the development mentality the team had from the start, so that we would be confident in shipping a 60Hz title. Then, we will go over the anatomy of a frame, followed by case studies of specific optimizations that were done during the final stretch of development to hit the 60Hz target at as high quality as possible. Also, a small note on what this presentation is not about. I'm not going to talk about the path tracing implementation or our hair rendering during this presentation. For path tracing, see the GDT talk by Ivan from NVIDIA. And from hair, please be patient. I'm also going to be a bit light on the GI implementation we used, which is the first iteration of what was shipped in Doom, the Dark Ages. I suspect more information will follow on that as well. I thought I'd start off by showing the launch trailer from last fall, so that those of you who have not played the game could get an idea of what it is about.
Every good story is true in one way or another. And I know one you haven't heard of. Dr. Jones. So what I'd like to do is put the guns down.
Go ahead. I'll knock your teeth out. what brings you to the Vatican, Indy?
I'm looking for someone. He stole something from me, and I mean to find out why.
Right now, I'm looking into the disappearance of my sister. And I believe Emmerich Voss is responsible.
So, this great circle, they think it's a conduit of some kind of power, correct?
Boss certainly does. He believes it'll secure his place in history. I'll have to study it some more. A circle must be complete to what? There's always a trigger.
Good luck, Indy.
Legends say these relics hold a force that could change the course of history. You're messing with powers beyond your control.
You should know by now. I am always in control.
You're good at this, Dr. Jones.
I know enough to get me into trouble.
Don't you want to know what this is all about?
You're damn right I do.
So, now that you have seen what the game ended up looking like, on with the development mentality. First of all, the overarching principle is that we will hit 60. This is not something to compromise on, and even if things did look bleak at times, this was a fixed requirement for us. To do this, we sacrifice latency for throughput in a lot of places. One frame delay is not as much at 60 Hz as it is at 30 Hz. We also try to amortize work whenever possible, and while this adds latency, it also spreads out load. We run with resolution scaling on, which allows us to iron out some drops and uneven frame rates to keep the game running at a good pace. When it comes to budgets, most data in the game is placed in fixed size pools. These are allocated upfront with a worst case bound. They cannot grow at runtime. For development builds, these are bigger. LODs and MIPS are streamed in on demand. For performance, we have a few soft targets on how long passes or systems are allowed to take, but overall perf budgets can vary wildly between different kinds of scenes. In the end phase, we focused on optimizing hotspots we saw were under 60 Hz or used too much memory. To track that, we used a series of automated tests that were run nightly that tracks performance and resource usage. With this, we get a set of perf metrics from several locations in each game map, as well as cutscenes, and can track progress on these over time. This was very helpful during the end phase to pinpoint where our efforts were needed the most. Data here include pass timings within a frame, overall GPU-CPU time, load times, number of models, as well as per shader stats such as VGPR usage. We also work actively with removing unused content and systems from the game. Fridays are designated cleanup days, where people are encouraged to take some time to remove unused systems or data. Additionally, on the rendering side, we have worked with regular perf reviews, preferably one per week, where we focus on a scene, digging into the performance to see if it's reasonable or requires additional work, either from art or code side. Here we try to work together with art, ensuring that what gets built can reach 60, but also try to be on the lookout for places where it turns out code is the limiting factor and needs extra work to be performant. I also want to add that for rendering, the only thing that we bake on a per map basis are reflection probes. Everything else is runtime systems to speed up iteration times for artists. To recap from the trailer, here is a selection of our heaviest scenes. This is the treehouse in Sukhothai. It has a high vantage point, lots of trees, and very little in terms of effective close-up occluders. Here's the Nepal cave. It's a lot of transparencies here, things such as ice and particles, as well as dither blended snow and very heavy rock shaders. The Gizeh lookout with lots and lots of instances and very few sectors, so almost everything out in the open is there all the time. Sectors are a way to load and unload parts of the map, but that doesn't really work out here, as the player can see everything. And finally, cutscenes, which are often heavy overall due to everything being dynamic and set up with lots of cutscene only cinematic lights. For the CPU side, we use the common pattern of overlapping one game simulation frame with one render frame, synchronized with a commit that copies game state data into the renderer. Let's take a look at Gizeh to see how a frame is rendered on the GPU. So here is a timeline for the same Gizeh image I showed before. It's heavily opaque bound, as you can see by the big block in the middle of the frame here. A simplified version would look something like this. Sizes of the passes are not to scale, but the general idea of the timeline at least. The red boxes here are where we do a lot of setup passes, preparing other work. Adding all that detail here would make the timeline a bit too cluttered. The async work might also not look exactly as it did on the previous slides. The boxes positions are scaled to fit into the time frame in which they have the ability to run. Often scenes do not require all of them to be that heavy. In the first red box there to the left, we start off the frame by doing a bit of setup. Terrain, wind and ecotopes. The latter being our GPU-based vegetation placement systems, which runs periodically and updates visible vegetation instances. We then generate an occlusion buffer by drawing occluders that were visible last frame. We don't treat everything as occluders. A system selects what seems fit best, but artists and designers can go in and force this on or off for specific models. After the occlusion buffer has been created and then downsampled, we enter the culling phase for the main camera view. For the majority of the models and surfaces, this is a GPU-only path. Only a select few things take a CPU path. All models are tested, giving us a list of surfaces to test. This can be seen as submeshes of a model with a specific material. Surfaces are then tested using their tighter bounding box and a draw call is set up. At this point, we know what to draw and can start compute skinning of skinned models. Lots of draws also go through the GPU triangle culling setup, where we build a new index list after testing each triangle against the occlusion buffer, as well as doing frustum, backface, and pixel-centered curring. This can reduce the amount of geometry to process in the vertex program quite a bit. Shadows are then rendered into an atlas using a combination of CPU and GPU generated draws. The GPU generated draws here are very similar to the main view culling described earlier. A lot of times we can skip rendering anything that has not moved by simply keeping a copy of the static part of the shadow map in a separate slot and rendering dynamics on top of a copy of that, trading rendering time for memory. At the same time as shadow drawing runs, we build dynamic bottom level acceleration structures and updated top level acceleration structures async. After shadows has been drawn, we render the full depth buffer using the output from the culling step. This is rendered on top of the existing occlusion buffer from the previous steps. Here motion vectors are also written out for objects that needs it. Full depth is needed for some setup that happens later. Also, at the same time, we do probe tracing for GI async, as we now have the shadow map prepared. Once we have a full depth buffer, we can start setting up things that rely on it. Visible geometry decals and water setup can be calculated. We calculate light tiles for the forward plus setup, and also particles and hair is set up. It's now time for the heaviest pass, for this scene at least. Opaque renders out full forward plus lighting, as well as storing out a mini G buffer to be used for some subsequent passes. Deferred might have been an option to look towards here, but we have a few different BRDFs, as well as some shaders doing light calculations in a custom way. Sticking with forward plus, which was what the take was already running, was the safe option. Once a G buffer is set up, we can use the probes we traced async before to do a GI final gather pass, storing out indirect diffuse light contribution. The sky part of the image here is garbage, as that's masked out by another buffer. We start from a world position and trace a short screen space ray. If that does not hit something, we shoot a hardware ray. The hit is diffuse only shaded using probe and accumulated into a spherical harmonic stored per pixel. This is then denoised. Even though we render most things forward, we still have a few things that rely on a deferred composite. Here, we apply the denoised GI from the previous pass, as well as screen space reflection and subsurface scattering. After everything opaque has been drawn, we blend in additional transparent surfaces such as water, ice, glass, particles, together with distortion. There were very little blended in the captured I used for the other slides, so here's an alternative image showing some particles. And then finally the image is post-processed. This pass happens async and overlaps into the next frame on the GPU, which means that we often end up with the actual present happening somewhere before the opaque pass starts. So now that you have seen how a frame is built up and what kind of common scene setups we have, let's take a look at the final stretch of development. Here is the result of the nightly test on Xbox Series S as of August 2024, roughly 4 months before the game would be in players' hands. These tests were made with resolution scaling off. As you can see, the majority of the levels struggle, some by just a tiny margin, but some with quite a bit. I've marked the levels under 60 with red, and there you can see all the main levels of the game. The green marked levels that average over 60 are all the smaller intro-exit levels. And here is a perf timeline showing the average FPS and how it changed over time towards release. Worth noting here is that this is not just a struggle to get things as fast as possible. We want things to look as good as possible. So graphs go up and down quite a bit as content is getting added, tweaked, removed, re-added, and also code optimizations come in. So what did we do optimization-wise? What follows might be a bit all over the place and mostly focus on what we did from the code side, but in a lot of places, taking captures, looking at expensive areas and talking to artists about what was costing helped us get very far. Taking that extra time to look through scenes in pics or something similar and give direct feedback tend to be appreciated in our experience, and it helps the studio align on perf. I'm also going to talk a bit more about how certain systems work and what we did there specifically for performance and quality. In no particular order, some general things that helped us save some time. We reuse skinning data between passes whenever possible. A pre-pass skinning compute shader is run. Very few things take the vertex shader skinning path. And as a general thing, packing and compressing data helps a lot, reducing bandwidth and allowing more data or instances to be used. Things like tightly packing structs, ensuring texture formats and vertex formats are compressed. Since we use GPU-driven draws for the most parts, the order in which pipelines are drawn matters a lot. We can save some time by ensuring alpha-compared pipelines are always last, giving a nice perf boost in depth and shadow passes. For alpha-tested pipelines, we also coarsely sort draws to get rid of some overdraw. Here we don't do a global sort, but instead sort in buckets of 1024 draws within one pipeline, as this can be done inside one group. This is usually enough as we rarely go over 1024 draws for a single alpha tested pipeline. As I mentioned earlier, the occlusion buffer is generated from visible occluder last frame. As these occluders mainly are bigger statics, this can sometimes not be enough. For cutscenes, we force some bigger dynamics to also be occluders, to avoid having to draw what's behind them. And sometimes we end up placing extra manual blockers, boxes or planes, to help with issues where the regular statics do not occlude enough or generate an occlusion buffer with holes. For the Giza scene, we had an issue where we generated too many draws, as the whole level was loaded at the same time. We added a small draw threshold, which could be tweaked manually to discard draws that had screen size under a certain threshold, and while not perfect, it was sufficient to get into budget without sacrificing too much visual quality. To avoid having the GPU spinning up empty draws, we have a draw compaction phase after GPU triangle calling that removes any draws with zero indices. This, combined with a predication step to skip any pipeline that has zero draws generated, was quite a boost. Somewhere around half a millisecond in scenes with a lot of pipelines, but very few at a time showing on screen. Vertex program export had some holes in it. They exported full float 4 when only certain values were used. Swapping to exporting floats made the compiler do a better job of packing into fewer float 4s. We also did a huge pass on vegetation models very late in the project to simplify and get triangle counts down. Almost all of the 500 models were remade and optimized during the last 2 months. As I said earlier, we try to spread out work over frames as much as possible. When we do a camera cut, in a cutscene for example, we do a full reset of temporal buffers and then present last frame a few times to allow temporal and amortized systems to catch up. Other things such as environmental changes can also impact temporal caches. These are cleared on demand, but was a steady source of bugs when transitioning from area to area with different environmental settings. We target full resolution, but drop down in resolution if we see that 60 Hz cannot be hit. We aim for this to be an exception though. The lowest we can go is 44% pixel count, which translates to the resolutions shown here. Another thing done quite light actually was that we tied anisotropic filtering to resolution scale. 100% resolution scale translates to 4 aniso by default, and then we slowly increase aniso up to 8 if we keep hitting 60 Hz. If scaling drops below 100%, we decrease aniso to 2. This gave us quite a bit of a perf boost when needed, but also a nice boost in quality when possible. Big thanks to Martin Fuller at Microsoft ATG for implementing this. For platforms that support it, we also rely heavily on variable rate shading to get a boost in perf in opaque and blended passes. This is specifically useful in scenes with lots of smoke or with a flatter look. Nepal is a good example of this. Initially, the shading rate buffer was calculated before post-processing. Late in the project, we moved this to happen after tone mapping with quite good results. Overall, this move could give us up to 3.5 milliseconds back in Nepal, with about 1.5 milliseconds of that being from the blended passes alone. Also, again with the help from Martin at ATG, we use a depth-aware implementation to get good quality along depth discontinuities. In hindsight, we probably have this a bit too aggressively tuned to lower the shading rate. It can also be a bit self-reinforcing, where a lower shading rate makes the final image a bit blurrier, which in turn makes us select a lower shading rate, and so on. The Nepal scenes also relied heavily on blended passes and refraction to get the intended look. For quite some time, these were the most expensive parts of the game, some bit below 30 Hz in places. The icicle and ice block shaders were originally made for very sparse use, where very few objects would add a bit of refraction to the scene. Quite the opposite happened, and the setup with the original intent did not scale at all. We ended up taking a big pass with artists here, swapping things to use cheaper shaders where possible, reducing overdraw. We also did a big pass on the refraction mask buffer we render before blended passes, which draws a normal extruded version of the mesh to mark what can be seen from refraction. This pass suffered from bad overdraw, so adding a depth buffer to this pass combined with artists tweaking the extrusion ranges helped a lot. So staying in Nepal, our snow deformation do not rely on hardware tessellation. Instead, we have a fixed base mesh of deformable snow, and we replace parts of it with a deformed mesh when needed. We use a camera-centered top-down projection of deformers, drawing deformation depth into a 2K by 2K render target. And most of the area isn't deformed in the majority of cases. Group shared memory and wave ops are used to downsample, such that 1 pixel in the downsampled target equals the filter kernel size. After this, we do a tile classification of what tiles need to be filtered. For each pixel in the downsampled target, we write atomically to a tile ID buffer with 1 extra border neighborhood to account for blur filter kernel size. Doing this saved about 1 millisecond on Series S on average compared to a full blur. Each detail patch maps to a 16 by 16 pixels in the full deformation target, 1 vertex per pixel. We use a downsample setup similar to the filtering to determine how many detail patches to build indirect draw args for. The base mesh is discarded in detail patches areas, and a dither is applied between detail meshes and base mesh to hide intersections. Neither of these meshes are included in the acceleration structures. The split between detail mesh and base mesh were made because it allowed the use of static low poly base meshes with vertex painting to cover up seams. We use a shadow atlas in which we allocate tiles of different size depending on what quality a light needs. For sun, this is a static allocation, but for other lights, we prioritize lights so that we can fit the most important ones in. As most lights are not moving, they allocate a static cache tile as well. This is an optimization we do where we render static geometry into a tile, and then we can copy that to a composite tile each frame and render dynamics on top of it if needed. We have two major paths for shadow map rendering: GPU for sun shadows and CPU for all other light types. The reason for this is simply that the GPU path landed quite late and we did not have time to get that working for all light types. We use 4 sun cascades, which are all player-centric, and updates once the player has moved a certain distance threshold. This means that the player can turn around and move a small distance before we need to redraw the static part of the shadow map. The closest cascade redraws dynamics every frame, and further cascades alternate to render every third frame. Dynamic vegetation is rendered as static for far away cascades to avoid a lot of draws. The static cache is amortized over several frames for the further cascades, spreading out the load of updating over to up to 30 frames. What goes into the cascades follow a fully GPU-driven path, which is very similar to the opaque rendering, but with some extra shadow-specific steps. Once a static cache slot is done, we generate a downscaled occlusion buffer for the cascade and use this to call dynamics. Dynamics are also discarded if they can't cast shadow into the view frustum. Another big difference is that shadows do not use the GPU triangle culling, as we did not have time to integrate that. In the end, we ended up with a lot of small triangles, so if we want to keep this system, we probably need to spend some time on that or something equivalent. For cutscenes, we end up with a lot of lights close to the camera, and initially, these lights often have high quality requirements, but they often only affect just character faces. Here's an image from our light counter-debugger showing that almost everything in this cutscene is hit by quite a few lights. We ended up allowing these lights to skip parts of the world to gather shadowcasters from, controlled by artists on a per light scene basis. So in this hat is a very important part of the visuals, but we had a lot of issues with our shadow maps having too much bias to make this look good. Often there were visible lights showing up under the brim of the hat close to the forehead. Screen space depth buffer tracing or contact shadows solves part of this issue, but in a lot of cutscenes this was not enough. We ended up placing an oriented disc on a joint on the hat so that it would pick up the transform from animations. Shadow receivers on the same character setup would then get this data so it could do an analytic disc ray intersection to get a precise artist control shadow. We do something very similar with hair as well, where we do place clipping spheres to discard hair strands so they don't clip through headwear. Here's a debug view of where the disc is placed. It's not perfectly on the brim of the hat, but rather slightly above to avoid light leakage. Our GI is based on a set of ray-traced probe cascades, and similar to shadows, we update one cascade every frame. The difference being that we don't fully update probes, we blend in new contributions to let the probe converge over time. We calculate how far rays can reach and limit our top-level acceleration structure to only have that area. Also, we skip any instance we deem likely to have low impact on GI. Here, we also amortize updates of dynamics, so not everything that animates is updated every frame. For vegetation, we have a bit of a simplified representation. We skipped wind animation and do not support alpha compared vegetation for ray tracing. Instead, we discarded triangles from alpha compared meshes proportional to the number of transparent pixels in the opacity map. Bottom level structures are built offline when supported. This allows us to free up time to update more dynamic acceleration structures instead. Late in the project, we worked a lot on reducing VGPR pressures for hit shaders. For platforms that support it, we set the pipeline up to be able to spill registers over a certain threshold. As long as the most used hit shaders were under this threshold, it gave a small net perf boost. Another thing that we found very important was to periodically look at the bug views to see ray traversal hotspots. Here is a view from a bus from the intro cutscene to Sukhothai intro. This bus was built axis aligned, but was set up as part of the cutscene, so it was moved around using a joint and ended up getting built as a dynamic acceleration structure as a 45-degree angle. Archer worked this setup so that we could get a proper aligned local bound, which roughly saved half a millisecond. And what's a shipping period without all the last second fixes to actually ship? Here is a few of the things that was done. We replaced the view through a tunnel with the screenshots and occluder plane to effectively discard all the things behind it. In some areas, such as the treehouse, extra large occluders were spawned to cut away unnecessary things that did not contribute to final frame quality. And some more stuff that perhaps are more like compiler workarounds. Division by 64 was not automatically replaced by shader compilers with bit shifts everywhere. Manually replacing that with bit shifts removed 60+ instructions in places. Adding an epsilon to an expression used in many places forced the compiler to rematerialize it, saving VGPRs and allowing us to go under 60 VGPR in places, at the cost of shader instructions. Sometimes this can be a tough balance to strike, but it might be better to do repeat calculations to reduce VGPR pressure and get better occupancy. And last, some levels with an overcast sky had some really strange shadow cascade setups with degenerate or clamped cascade sizes. We added code to skip any cascade too small to do anything, avoiding having to render the whole world to just a few pixels. That's all for me. I will try to answer questions in the Q&A, and hopefully more people from the team will be able to join in the Discord channels to answer questions that I cannot. Thank you.
And we are back. Joining us now is Joel, and well, thank you, Joel, for this amazing talk. It's just great talk on the practical realities of optimization. Let's move to our live Q&A. Keep the questions coming from Discord. We will try to get to as many as possible. And before we start, preemptively forgive me if I misspell your name or anything else. I'll blame it on my Italianness. Okay, let me open the question sheet and let's go through some of this. So first question we have here from Russell Gillette. For gathering VGPR stats, did you select a single hardware target or have a spectrum of target hardwares to get a broader idea of perf across platforms?
No, in this case we only used the Xbox target for gathering VGPR stats. Of course, it would have been good to gather more data, but the VGA stats are mainly on Xbox.
All right, we'll start just with a very hardcore low-level question. Second question for Kay Mishra. So for your ray tracing, which PBR models did you use for the diffuse and specular components?
Use the regular Lambert diffuse and a GGX specular for the GR calculations.
Okay, we have another question about ray tracing. I think you will get a few of those. So from Simon Fenney, how often are screen space rays successful versus real hardware rays? And if the latter has dedicated traversal, would you drop the screen space?
I must say I didn't really work that much on the ray tracing part so that I can answer that question. I'll leave that open for someone else in the team to answer in the chat, hopefully later tonight.
All right, yeah. No worries. I had that curiosity as well, actually. Another from Russell Giroux, did you use mesh shaders in any capacity?
No mesh shaders at all. So we use a pre-pass triangle culling solution instead, and regular draw calls.
All right. From Kartik, what do you mean by predicating full execute calls? I think this is related, right? Like VKX conditional rendering?
Yes, so that it's predication in DirectX speak and conditional rendering in Vulkan speak, so that's the same thing. But we only ended up doing predication on Xbox, I think, in the end.
All right. From Ryan, I will not venture to pronounce the surname. Was anything done on the full reset on camera cut to mitigate first frame jank, especially since with many cuts? And this is asking specifically anything done in code or by artists in data?
Not really. We try to keep as much as possible between camera cuts, so it's not really a full reset. It's a full reset of accumulative buffers. But if the camera cut is short enough, most of the shadow maps can be kept, for example, since we have them camera centered. So it's not a complete full reset, but reset in the sense that it matters for on-screen temporal effects.
Cool, thank you. And now we have a couple of DRS questions. I realized that the questions now are in the order of the presentations that people looked at certain topics and had, of course, curiosity. So both Sebastian Lagarde and Ryan are asking related questions. So Sebastian is asking, is it software or hardware VRS? And then we have a more specific question, was the VRS re-implemented in software for PS5?
So we only use hardware VRS when available. I think that should answer. So on PS5 Pro, there's VRS, but not on the base model.
Okay, a question from John Moore. Can you share some details on what the optimization pass on foliage asset entailed?
Don't have the full details there. So the original models had a little bit too many surfaces and triangles. So the pass was to go over them, merge models as much as possible, and get rid of triangles, making everything simpler, pretty much.
And surface, in your case, is basically a draw call, right? Like a mesh and set of materials.
Yes, the surface is a sub-mesh with a specific material.
Okay. I have another question on VRS here, like just how significant were the perf gains from VRS?
The gains were significant. It's several milliseconds for sure on the 60 Hz frames. But it comes as a cost in quality. That's for sure.
And a question from Jussi. You mentioned that you shipped with a forward plus lighting model. Do you think using deferred as much as possible would have been beneficial for performance, or were you in the end happy with forward plus?
I mean, we do have a semi-fat G buffer outputted anyway, so perhaps it would have made sense to use deferred, but we do quite a few things on the per material basis that differs. Like the hat shadow, for example, is only evaluated on skin. Other things has very specific light setups. Doing that in a deferred setting would have been costly, or we would have to have a lot of things forward anyway.
And I actually don't remember. Like, do you remember on top of your head, like how fat is the G buffer? Like, what kind of render targets were used there?
It's 4 targets, I think, on top of my head.
Okay.
I had it in a slide, but I don't have access to the slide right now. It's not very fat compared to like a full big G buffer with more material information.
Cool. So here is a question. I may have missed it, but what IoT method is being used, considering this seems to be a GPU-driven pipeline? Sorry, OIT. OIT.
Yeah, OIT. So the transparent parts are not GPU-driven. We are GPU-driven in the opaque and parts of the shadow pass. And of course, there's certain parts on the opaque pass that is also CPU-driven. So it's a hybrid setup. The transparent stuff is fully CPU-driven.
All right. We have a question from Brian Karras. I think this is complicated to answer online, maybe, but given that you have a section called frame breakdown for a talk about hitting 60 Hertz, and you have example shots, I expected to see timings for the frame breakdown. Do you have those?
I have those. I don't have them available right now. And sorry, that probably should have been there in the slides. They vary quite a bit between frames, between the setup. So yeah, they should have been there.
Yeah. I mean, reading at like a lot of numbering slides is also not necessarily ideal, but maybe if there is further curiosity, it can be resolved over Discord there.
Yeah.
Kevin Todisco asks, were the solution contributed by ATG easily carried over to PS5? So this is a spicy question. So he promises understand if maybe not many details can be shared here. So were the solution contributed by ATG easily carried over to PS5, or how much level of investment was required to get those working across all platforms? Any unique challenges standing up those solutions, VRS in particular, maybe on PS5?
I mean, generally speaking, generating a VRS buffer or setting up a anisotropy sampler is pretty much the same across platforms. That's just general logic that sets up those things. So I don't think there was much of an issue there.
Okay, Jamie Hayes is joining Brian Karras in asking for the frame breakdown, so I'll skip that, and maybe this is something to be left to Discord. Let's move to the next question. Yeah,
I'll try to spend some time tomorrow and see if I can get something.
All right, thank you. Alper Otskan is asking, given you have CPU and GPU gathers for different parts of the scene, do you think in the future it would be feasible to have this workload be shared between GPU and CPU dynamically?
I don't think so. I think that maintaining one code path as much as possible is probably better. So if we would do something, we would probably move more stuff to be on the GPU side.
I see. From Nico May. Okay, this is interesting. With the various amortization efforts, were there any frame pacing issues where, for example, one cascade took significantly longer than the one frame before and caused a stutter that the dynamic res couldn't handle?
Yeah, there were frame pacing issues, and one of the things that we worked hard on was moving vegetation and a lot of other things that were typically considered dynamic to be considered static for further cascades. And as those were amortized over up to 30 frames in cases, we could get the stuttering down quite a bit. But there's always issues. You have to work around them in some way with content and setups and so.
All right, thank you. From Matthias Reiferton. Given the closest shadow cascade was rendered every frame, what was its word space extents?
This is artist controlled on the per level environment settings. So typically it's somewhere around 10 to 15 meters, or it should be something like 20 to 30 meters square. You can see it quite easily if you walk around in the game. There, depending on your shadow settings, there can be a quite noticeable line or edge that ticks from time to time.
It's interesting sometimes, like the specificity of the questions that we get. I have one actually that I don't understand myself. Maybe you can, maybe it's obvious to you, but from Simon Fanny again. Assume for foliage and shadows GI, you are waiting for OMMs.
Yeah, so for GI, OMMs would be nice. It would be, of course, very nice to be able to use that. The path tracing implementation uses OMMs. But for the GI, we do this trick to get BLAS and TLAS sizes down on vegetation to just discard random triangles to emulate transparency. It works, but if you would look at the ray tracing geometry and actually ray trace the shadows, it of course wouldn't work.
Another question from Sebastian Lagarde. Adding epsilon to reduce VGPL pressure is for the Xbox shader compiler only?
I mean, it could be related to any shader compiler, so I don't think it would be specific there.
And another from Kemishra. What ray acceleration structure did you cycle through and experiment with before settling on this one? Also, why did you settle on the one you did in the end?
Sorry, I don't really understand the question.
So he's asking if you tried different ray acceleration structures and why you settled on the one that you settled on?
I leave that question for Sergey to try to answer on the Discord. He worked on the ray tracing stuff, and I barely touched it, I must say.
That's fair. That's fair. Okay. A question from Chunyu Yang. Could you share how much gain you see from moving the post-processing passes into async?
It's tricky since overlapping, of course, pushes other stuff away. But on several milliseconds, I would say, at least. But But when it overlaps, of course, it takes a little bit longer because other stuff is running at the same time. Especially on very post-processing heavy passes such as cutscenes, the overlap is significant.
I'm trying to decipher this question. UI as part of deferred composite? Maybe for the audience, when you put down the questions, if you can spell them out in a little bit more detail, it would help us. I don't know if this makes sense to you. I guess it's asking something about the UI and how it interacted with the deferred composite step.
It doesn't. The third composite is compositing GI and some other things onto the existing lighting buffer. The UI is composited later on after async on the post processing queue.
All right, let's get just through maybe a couple more. Thank you for being available to ask and answer all these questions live, and then of course, like, we will keep going over Discord. One from Felipe Lira. So can you expand a bit on how you do the vegetation discard based on the proportion of pixels in the opacity maps?
It's just a heuristic, to be honest. So this this leaf has this amount of opaque pixels, then they are covered by triangles this much. We discard a proportional amount of triangles from the BLOS. And that emulates the opacity.
Let's go to this one from Nicolas Silvagne. What did you use for sun shadow beyond the last sun cascade?
Beyond
the last sun cascade?
There's nothing.
Very fair. All right.
The last cascade is quite big. I think you saw it on the screenshot there on Giza that it reaches all the way to the far pyramid, and then the levels are built in such a way that the shadows doesn't matter that far.
All right, we have too many. I don't think we can finish them, so we will definitely move over to Discord for the remaining ones. Actually, I'll ask one myself because I can. And this is just a curiosity, right? Like, because I personally worked in a couple of different game studios and different philosophies, and so I really wonder, what is your take? Like, in the end, how did you work sharing the responsibility of fitting everything in 60 hertz between, the engineering side, doing this awesome code optimization and last minute tricks, and asking artists to remove stuff or hand optimize and just fit into the budget by changing the data? Like, how did you balance that kind of responsibilities?
So the way that we work, the balance happens naturally, I would say. Everybody works towards a common goal, and there's no such things as getting the performance up here is engineering's responsibility or specifically art responsibility. Instead, we look at things, we work at things together. We perhaps decide that lighting is costing too much in this scene. What can we do to solve that? Perhaps that's art. Perhaps we see that the code is doing something bad. Perhaps we need to optimize parts here. But as art is working on making things fast on their side, we can also try to push things as far as possible on the code side, like reducing VGPRs, getting higher occupancy, and like overlaps and things like that. So it's a collaborative effort all the way.
That's really the best answer. Like being able to work closely between the two departments is always, I think, a blessing in a production studio. All right, I think, well, thank you again for the work on the presentation and for being here live with us to try to answer this giant amount of questions from our audience. We will enter a short break and we will see you. We will see you at 9:30 for Overwatch.